Well, hey there, friends. I'm your host, Penny, and this is Criminally Nerdy. How's everybody doing? I don't know about you guys, but last week was a week. This is now my fourth attempt at recording. The first two went south because I decided it would be fun to just, get sick. I was able to get through the third recording. Got it all nice and edited. I was maybe 5 minutes from finishing and uploading when my whole system seized up. In that process, I lost the entire episode. The whole damn thing. So this is my fourth and final swing. If it doesn't work, I'm gonna throw the whole damn thing away. Just kidding. I'll figure something else out, but let's just hope that fourth time's a charm. I want to give a huge shout out to my wife. Not only has she been taking care of me, but she's also been taking care of the kids and doing it all while she's tackling a pretty big life change. She has been working from home since COVID began, and during that time, she just casually decided to get her master's degree. Yes, I know, I married up. She got her first post-MBA position with a new company last week, and it's an in-office position. I really thought she was going to struggle more with having to put on real pants every day, but she's handling it like a champ. Even though she quite literally stumbled and fell because her legs are so confused by this whole walking into an office thing. She pressed on, so she's absolutely killing it. Don't worry, guys. She doesn't listen to the podcast. We're safe. All jokes aside, I'm just super proud of her and really thankful for all of her help, so I wanted to share that with you guys. This episode is now being aired on April 23rd, which is National Take a Chance Day according to the interwebs. It was started in the early 2000s to encourage people to try new things. So, call into work. Climb a mountain. Move to another country. Tell your boss I said it was okay. As long as you're listening to Take a Chance on Me by ABBA, it'll be excused. In podcast news, I'm glad to hear you guys liked the outtakes at the end of last week's episode. I'll keep that up as long as you guys keep telling me what you want to hear. This podcast is for you. Otherwise, it's just me talking to myself in my closet. That wouldn't really surprise anyone. I was also wondering if any of you would be interested in Criminally Nerdy Pride merch. I'm batting around a few ideas, and I'm going to be gauging some interest and go from there, but either way, something fun will be coming. And, yeah, that's about it for the good stuff. Now, I'm going to ruin your day. The rest of this is going to be grim. I'd never heard of these two until I stumbled across them while I was researching Myra Hindley and Ian Brady, which I will get to them at some point, but this killer couple took me down a wild rabbit hole. Every detail is more terrible than the last. These crimes took place in England, so I apologize in advance for any names or towns that I just mispronounce or butcher. I'll be doing my best, but the Midwest in me is undeniable. I'm going to put a massive warning over this entire episode because it is brutal. This case deals with sexual assault, domestic violence, child abuse, mutilation, torture, and murder. Just all the bad things. Some of the victims in this case are children. I will be summarizing the best I can. If you are someone who is an expert on this case, don't come at me, because yes, there are going to be some details that I have left out and others that I'm only glossing over because they're just extremely upsetting and they don't necessarily add value to what you need to know about these monsters. Trust me, you're going to get the full picture. Just be cautioned, this is an awful case. If that's not something you're prepared to hear, no hard feelings. I'll catch you next week. The case I have for you today is that of Fred and Rose West, a couple whose macabre crimes took place behind the closed doors of their home in Gloucester, England, which would become known as the House of Horrors. Between 1967 and 1987, there were 12 confirmed and many other suspected murder victims, some of which were their own children. Some of my sources for this episode were Crime Investigation UK, Biography.com, Serial Killers Podcast did a great episode on them, the TV show The World's Most Evil Killers did an episode on Fred and Rose in 2017, and I watched the 2021 documentary Rose West, Born Evil, directed by Jared Wright. Fred West met Rosemary Letts in early 1969, waiting for a bus in Cheltenham, England. Rose was 15, Fred was 28. Look, just no. Immediately no. What the fuck does a 28-year-old man see in a 15-year-old girl? Nothing. Nothing, my friends. Not a single damn thing. But, alright, I'm not going to go off on that tangent right now because there is plenty we're going to be angry about on this journey. Initially, Rose was not interested in Fred at all and actually thought he was homeless. She was flattered by the attention he gave her over the following days as he sat next to her at the same bus stop, but she twice refused to go on a date with him. She did, however, allow him to walk her home. During their conversations, Fred had gotten some sympathy from her by telling her that he had 2 daughters and had been abandoned by his wife, and he told her how much he wished for more children. Fred also found out from these conversations that Rose worked at a local, either a tea house or a bread shop. I read both. He persuaded a customer who was heading in to give Rose a gift and tell her it was from the man outside. He then asked Rose out a 3rd time, and this time she said yes. Shortly after, the two began a relationship. Rose would visit him often at the Lake House Caravan Park where he lived with his 2 young daughters, Charmaine and Anna Marie. Rose treated them kindly, often insisting they take the girls on excursions to find wildflowers. Aside from the statutory nature of it all, you've got the meet cute, the suave date invitation, and the poor abandoned little girls who are bonding with the new mother figure in their life. It sounds like a fairy tale. What could possibly go wrong? Well, friends, you're listening to this show, so you know this is no fairy tale. It's a horror story, where everything goes wrong. Before we get into who they were together, let's take a look at who Fred and Rose were before they met. Fred West was born September 29, 1941 at Bickerton College in Muchmarcle, a small village in Hertfordshire, England. He was the first surviving child of Walter and Daisy Lett, a poor family of farm workers. When Fred was 4, the family moved to Moorcourt Cottage, which was near Moorcourt Farm on the outskirts of Muchmarcle. Fred's father worked the farm as a milking herdsman and a harvest hand. By the time Fred was 10, his mother had given birth to 8 children, 6 of which had survived. Fred's mother made no secret that he was her favorite. He was seen as a mama's boy, and he had little companionship outside of his siblings. Fred's father was a strict disciplinarian and a sexually depraved man. He not only engaged in and encouraged Fred to engage in bestiality, but led Fred to believe that rape and incest were just normal. Not only from his father telling him about how he would just beat women who didn't comply with his sexual demands, but also from seeing his father repeatedly sexually abuse his sisters. This is why Fred didn't say anything until much later in life that his mother had begun sexually abusing him on a regular basis at the age of 12. Though Fred's younger brother Doug dismissed Fred's claims as fantasy, Fred's later behavior would surely suggest that there's some truth to the childhood abuse claims. Fred was barely literate when he left school at the age of 15 to begin working as a full-time laborer on Moorcourt Farm. He and his brothers had begun socializing at a local youth club when he was 16. Fred aggressively hounded women, seeing them as objects meant only for his pleasure. He said he would take girls out to the fields and they would have sex, but he was vague in regards to whether all of these acts were consensual. Whenever a girl did consent, she would report back to her friends that she had been quickly disappointed. Fred was a bad lay, and he did not care. He was only out for his own gratification, and he could not care less how his partner felt. At 17, Fred was in a motorcycle accident that caused him to suffer a fractured skull, a broken arm, and broken legs. He was unconscious for 7 days and walked with braces for months. After the accident, friends and family noticed that he was prone to fits of rage. 2 years later, he suffered another head injury when he groped a woman on a fire escape and she turned around and punched him in the face, sending him down 2 flights of stairs. Yes, girl! In June of 1961, Fred's 13-year-old sister Kitty told her mother that Fred had been raping her since December, and she was now pregnant. Fred was arrested, and he fully admitted to it, stating, "Doesn't everybody do it?" Mommy came to his side and was prepared to testify on his behalf. He was tried on November 9th, but just before her testimony, Kitty changed her mind about taking the stand, and the case collapsed. Their mother's support of Fred likely had an influence on this decision. Much of Fred's family disowned him, and shockingly, his mother did banish him from the house. He lived with his Aunt Violet for a while, but by mid-1962, he had reconnected with his parents, though the rest of his family still wanted nothing to do with him. He met Catherine Rena Costello at a dance hall in 1960. They dated for a couple of months before she returned to Scotland. They reconnected in September of 1962 when Fred was 21. Rena was pregnant at the time by an Asian man and had been shunned by many members of her family because they were upset about her having a mixed-race child. This didn't seem to bother Fred, though. He and Rose were married on November 17th, with the sole guest being Fred's brother John. Shortly after the birth of their first daughter Charmaine, the two moved to the Bridgeton district of Glasgow, Scotland. They welcomed a second daughter, Anna Marie, in July of 1964. According to the family nanny, Isa McNeil, Rena was doing her best as a young mother of two, but Fred treated the girls terribly. He kept the girls on the bottom bunk of a bunk bed that had been fitted with bars, essentially caging them in. They were only allowed out while he was at work. Not only was he not really rocking it as a parent, but he was a shit husband. He was growing increasingly sadistic in their sexual relationship, and he had multiple affairs with other women. Rena learned of these affairs when it was discovered that he had fathered a child with another woman. This drove Rena into the arms of another man, John McFall. Fred once caught John and Rena kissing, and so naturally he decided that the best course of action would be to walk up and punch Rena in the face. John immediately punched Fred in response and in defense of Rena, so Fred decided to pull out a knife and slash at John's abdomen. But much to his surprise, it did not slow John down. John punched him again, and Fred backed down like the little bitch he is. When later recalling the incident, John said he couldn't tackle a man, but he wasn't slow in attacking women. Fred was working as an ice cream van driver in 1965 when he accidentally ran over and killed a young boy. He was cleared by the police, but he feared retaliation from the locals, so he fled back to Gloucester, England with both children, Charmaine and Anna Marie. He rented a caravan at the Timberland Caravan Park and found work at a local abattoir, which, if you remember from the Catherine Knight episode, is a slaughterhouse, a large industry in the area at the time. Rena stayed in Glasgow for a few months before she, nanny Isa McNeil, and family friend Anne McFall joined Fred and the girls. McNeil and McFall were from impoverished backgrounds and hoped to find work in England. By 1966, Fred had really started to go off the rails. He was super controlling, prone to violent mood swings, and was said to have begun sexually abusing Charmaine at this time. Desperate to escape the situation, Rena called John McLaughlin and begged him to rescue her, the children, and Isa McNeil. They decided that he and John Trotter, Isa's boyfriend, would drive down and discreetly take them all back to Scotland. If you hadn't noticed, Anne McFall, the family friend who came with Rena to England, was not included in the getaway plan. That is because she had become infatuated with Fred, who had promised to marry her. Like, what? Did his bedroom skills vastly improve or something? Because his personality sure as shit isn't doing him any favors. It's likely that McFall had tipped Fred off about the plan because he showed up at the meeting point, much to the surprise of everyone. A fight broke out and police were called. Fred clutched to the children, Charmaine and Anna Marie, so they couldn't get in the vehicle with their mother, while screaming at Rena that he would kill her if he ever saw her again. This didn't scare Rena off, though. She traveled to England often to visit her daughters over the years. As time went on, Anne had grown resentful of the fact that Fred had yet to divorce Rena and follow through on his promise to marry her. Like, are you surprised that he isn't a stand-up guy? Really? Still, she continued the relationship with Fred until July of 1967, when at 8 months pregnant with his child, she disappeared. Rose Letts was the fifth of 7 children born on September 29th of 1953 in Devon, England, to Bill and Daisy Letts. Her father had been in the Navy, but was forced to leave to tend to his wife, who was having a difficult pregnancy with Rose. Bill had great difficulty adjusting to civilian life. He was brutal and violent, known to bully and downright terrify his wife. Former neighbors recall hearing shouting coming from the home, and that Daisy's teeth would begin to chatter in sheer fear of him. The intense intimidation she was subjected to only worsened her already severe depression to the point where it was recommended that she receive electroconvulsive therapy, also known as ECT, while pregnant. And keep in mind, we're talking about ECT in the early 1950s. It was still very crude in its development. The sole purpose of the treatment was to induce severe seizures. People would break their teeth, they would bite through their tongues, they would even suffer from amnesia. This treatment was administered multiple times through Daisy's pregnancy, the last one taking place the day before Rose was born. Many believe that this may have caused Rose to suffer neurological development injuries. The Letts family was dysfunctional to say the least. Bill Letts suffered from paranoid schizophrenia, but he never disclosed this to his family or sought treatment. He was an absolute tyrant who forced Daisy to keep the house spotless and held the children to extremely strict standards. One example I read was that he would have the children clean the carpets with toothbrushes. Bill Letts sexually abused Rose and her sister Patricia. He favored Rose, though. Rose had retreated inward from an early age and became very passive. Bill saw this vulnerability as something to take advantage of, so he began grooming her. When he did start sexually abusing her, she didn't see this as alarming. The normalization of sex and violence from such a young age were a combination that would all but guarantee that she would not only continue to seek out abusive relationships, but that she would likely develop the desire to start inflicting the abuse. She was not known to be particularly bright in school. She was slow to pick up on simple concepts. She ended up being held back a year, which led to her developing sooner than her classmates. When she hit puberty around age 13, she became fixated on her body. She would often parade around nude in front of her younger brothers and was rumored to have molested at least one of them. By age 15, Rose had earned a reputation with the older men in the community, who she naturally gravitated towards, as a nymphomaniac. Alright, now that we have a little bit of background on who they each were before they met, let's get back to where we left off. Now that they were in a relationship, Rose decided it was time to introduce him to good old mom and dad. Shockingly, they did not approve. The incest, abuse, all that jazz, fine. But dating an older man? That's where they drew the line. And look, I am not cool with any of it. Like, none of it. But I just find that to be like such a weird hill to die on. Maybe they just got a justifiably bad vibe from him. Her parents forbid her from seeing Fred under threat of calling social services to report him. 'Cause forbidding rebellious teenagers from doing stuff is totally foolproof, right? Right, so she immediately defied them. Once they found out that she was continuing to see them, they made good on their threats of calling social services. Rose was placed in a home for troubled teenagers in Cheltenham in August of 1969, but was released back to her parents on her 16th birthday. Fred was serving a short prison sentence at the time for petty theft, but as soon as he was released, he and Rose moved into a flat together. Rose's father made one last desperate attempt to keep the two apart and had her examined by police. It was found at this time that she was pregnant. She was released on the agreement that she would terminate her pregnancy, stop seeing Fred, and return home to her family. Now this is going to knock your socks off, but Rose did none of this. She went right back to living with Fred. The couple moved to a ground floor flat of a 2-story home on Midland Road in Gloucester. Rose gave birth to their first child, Heather Ann, in October of 1970. It has been widely speculated that Heather was actually fathered by Rose's own father, Bill. 2 months later, Fred went to prison again for theft. This time for a year and a half, leaving 17-year-old Rose alone to look after all 3 girls. And I will say, as a mother of 3, sometimes it can feel like 1 million children. And I'm not doing it alone. This, however, does not excuse the brutal treatment she dealt to the girls while Fred was incarcerated. Anna Marie recalls in her harrowing autobiography, Out of the Shadows, that she and Charmaine were subjected to verbal abuse and extreme beatings. Anna Marie was quick to back down, but Charmaine pushed back. She was a little spitfire and wouldn't hesitate to tell Rose that my real mummy wouldn't swear at us or shout at us like that. No matter how vicious Rose became, Charmaine refused to show signs of breaking. Rose saw this as Charmaine antagonizing her and would become infuriated. A childhood friend and neighbor, Tracy Giles, reported that she had once shown up to the West's flat unannounced and saw Charmaine standing in a chair, naked, with her arms bound behind her back. Rose was standing next to her with a wooden spoon that she had been beating the child with just before Tracy walked in. In June of 1971, shortly before Fred's release from prison, when Tracy came to see Charmaine, Rose said, "She's gone to live with her mother, and bloody good riddance." Meanwhile, Rena was becoming increasingly anxious and depressed about her children, according to her sister Christine. In August of 1971, she found Fred and Rose's address to go confront them and regain custody of her children. This was the last time Rena was seen. After his release, Fred and Rose were married on January 29, 1972, at the Gloucester Register's office, where Fred fraudulently noted that he was a bachelor. A couple of months later, when Rose was pregnant with their second child, they moved from the Midland Road home to a nearby 3-story home at 25 Cromwell Street. To help offset the cost of the larger home, Fred and Rose initially converted the upper floor rooms into bedsits, which is where lodgers are given a room and share common areas such as bathrooms and kitchens. To help maintain their privacy, Fred installed a cooker and washroom on the ground floor so that lodgers would not need to enter the area where the family lived. Additionally, lodgers were not permitted access to the garden on the property. After the birth of their second child, May, on June 1, 1972, they realized the lodgers weren't going to close the gap on their income as much as they needed. So, with Fred's encouragement, Rose began to use one of the upstairs rooms to partake in sex work. She advertised her services in a local magazine. Fred cut several peepholes in the walls and doors so that he could watch the encounters. Rose would also have casual sex with male and female lodgers and people that Fred would meet through work. And it's like, hey, whatever. As long as everyone's consenting, that's your business. You're adults. Like, go for it. But again, you're listening to this show, so you know that wasn't always the case. Rose was known to have bragged to many that no man or woman could completely satisfy her. Her encounters began to get more and more violent, especially with women. She would suffocate them against their will and would use larger and larger sex toys without their permission. When the woman would show signs of discomfort, Rose would become wildly excited and begin to berate the women, saying things like, "Aren't you woman enough to take it?" Fuck all the way off, Rose. Like, fuck off. As far as you think you can fuck off further. Aren't you woman enough to take it when someone says no? Or are you too fragile for that? When Fred wasn't watching Rose, he would take part in threesomes with her. Both Fred and Rose took sadistic pleasure in taking people past their sexual limits against their will, typically using bondage, dominance, and inflicting pain. To cater to their fetishes, they collected a large amount of toys, restraints, magazines, and photographs. Some of the photographs included bestiality and children. These things would eventually be kept in the torture chamber that Fred built in their basement. Rose's father eventually came to tolerate his daughter's marriage to Fred. When he discovered what Rose was doing for work, he began to partake in her services, with Fred's blessing. What is happening? I need someone to please tell me, break this down for me. Help me understand what in the entire fuck is wrong with these people. Of note, by 1983, Rose had given birth to a total of 8 children, at least 3 of which were fathered by clients. Fred took them all in as his own and explained that the reason that their skins were different colors was because his great-grandmother was African American. Now don't go thinking that outside of the bedroom, life was just peachy keen. It was not. Each of the children had several chores that they were to complete, and it was outside of the realm of what you would expect normal children needed to be doing for chores. They were rarely allowed outside of the house unless one of their parents were with them. They had very strict rules they were to follow, and the penalty for breaking the rules was severe physical punishment, usually handed out by Rose. Sometimes they were punished for no reason at all other than for Rose's enjoyment. To avoid talk around the town, she was careful not to mark the children's faces or hands. Between 1972 and 1992, the West children were admitted to the hospital a total of 31 times. Each time, the injuries were explained away as accidents and were never reported to social services. It is astounding, the number of people who failed these children and the number of times it happened. The violence at home wasn't just physical. Discussed in her autobiography, Anna Marie talks in detail about the abuse she and her siblings suffered at the hands of her father and stepmother. In September of 1972, Fred and Rose took a then 8-year-old Anne to the basement torture room and forced her to undress. When she hesitated, Rose ripped the clothes from her body. Rose then held her down and actively encouraged Fred to do what he did. After the first assault, Rose said, "I'm sorry. Everybody does it to every girl. It's a father's job. Don't worry, and don't say anything." No it's fucking not. No it's fucking not. The attacks continued, sometimes by Fred, sometimes by Rose, sometimes by both. By the age of 13, Fred and Rose had forced Anna Marie to begin engaging in sex work, which she clearly could not consent to. She was told to tell clients that she was 16, and Rose was always present to make sure her true age was never revealed. Anna Marie was not the only one to endure sexual assaults at the hands of her parents. In October of 1972, they picked up hitchhiker 17-year-old Carolyn Owens and hired her to work as the children's live-in nanny. It didn't take long before she became uncomfortable by Fred and Rose's overt sexual advances. She was so grossed out that she just quit and returned home. The Wests couldn't just let her go, though. Knowing that she frequently hitchhiked, they hatched a plan to kidnap her. On October 6, 1972, they lured her to their vehicle with an apology for their behavior and an offer for a ride home. Once she was inside the vehicle, Rose climbed into the back seat and began touching her. When she protested, Fred stopped the car, called her a bitch, and punched her until she was unconscious. Fred and Rose then bound and gagged her with a scarf and duct tape and took her back to their home, where she was subjected to a prolonged, vicious sexual assault. The next morning, Fred threatened to lock Carolyn in the dungeon, let his friends have their way with her, and then bury her body beneath the paving stones of Gloucester. He bragged that he had killed hundreds of girls, and she would be no different. Then, like flipping a switch, they calmly said this could all be avoided if she would return and be their nanny. I just cannot imagine how terrifying that would be. This poor girl. Seeing this as her only chance to survive, she agreed and actually began to vacuum to show them that she had every intention of staying. Later that day, she and Rose went to do laundry and she was able to escape. At first, she was too ashamed to tell her mother what had happened, but when her mother noticed the bruises on her body, Carolyn burst into tears and told her mother everything. Mama Bear immediately went into action and called the police. The Wests were arrested and charged with assault, indecent assault, actual bodily harm, and rape. Unfortunately, Carolyn could not bear to have to relive the events, so she was unable to testify. Without her, police were forced to reduce the charges. The Wests pled guilty to the lesser counts of indecent assault and causing actual bodily harm. They were fined £50 each and allowed to walk free from the court. When Carolyn heard the news, she attempted suicide. Thankfully, her attempt was unsuccessful, as she would become a key witness in later years. After suffering a particularly severe beating from Rose, Anna Marie left home in 1979. With her out of the house, Heather and May became Fred's main targets. Fred was known to say things to the girls such as, "I made you, I can do what I like with you." He also let the girls know that he intended to impregnate each of them at least once. Though both girls struggled with Fred's abuse, May later recalled that Heather had a much harder time dealing with it. She began biting her nails to the point where they bled. She was drinking alcohol. She was very skittish around men, and she would be awakened repeatedly by nightmares. Fred and Rose noticed Heather's behavior, but it didn't stop them. If anything, it fed the monster inside of them both. Fred, who for some reason had never really liked Heather, would sling insults at her, saying things like she was a lesbian, she was ugly, she was a bitch, just whatever came to mind in the moment. And anytime these taunts seemed to bother her, Rose would then laugh in her face. Though the West children were under strict rule not to talk about their home life, like how Fred would make all of the children watch porn with him, poor Heather was unable to keep it in. Which, how could you? She complained to friends about the abuse she and her siblings were enduring at home. She had also confirmed rumors about her mother's sex life, which had reached many of her classmates. One of her classmates mentioned this to their parents. As it turned out, this classmate's father was actually one of Rose's clients, so word got back to Rose and Fred that Heather had broken the rules. After she left school in 1986, she applied for numerous jobs in an effort to get away from the family home. When her application to work at a holiday camp in Torquay was rejected, she was absolutely crushed. The whole family heard her sobbing in her room on the night she received the letter. The next day, June 19, 1986, when the other West children returned home from school, their parents informed them that Heather actually had gotten the job and she had left home to take it. But then they couldn't really keep their story straight. Rose told one neighbor that Heather had run away. When her siblings asked why Heather never contacted them, they were told that Heather had eloped with her lesbian lover. When her siblings said that they should file a missing persons report, Fred said they definitely couldn't do that because a search would reveal that Heather was involved in credit card fraud. In the years following her disappearance, Fred would often joke with the other children that if they did not behave, they would end up under the patio like Heather. Thankfully, this joke would come back to bite him in the ass. With Heather gone, Fred needed someone else to turn his attention to. He focused on his 13-year-old daughter, Louise. In May of 1992, he assaulted her. When she told Rose what had happened, she told the girl, "Oh well, you were asking for it." The assaults continued, and at this point, Fred had taken to filming them. Louise found the courage to tell one of her friends what her father had done. Her friend told their mother, who immediately reported it to police. On August 6, 1992, police obtained a warrant to search the property. Fred, being a lifelong petty thief, made it easy for them to use the pretext of looking for stolen goods. The search did yield nearly 100 pornographic videos, some homemade, some purchased, but they did not find any that contained Louise. However, Louise made a full statement to a specially trained solicitor about the abuse, which, according to the University of Law UK, a solicitor is a qualified legal professional who provides legal advice and is responsible for representing and defending a client's interests. The children were placed in foster care the next day. Medical exams revealed evidence of extreme physical and sexual abuse. The investigation led to Fred being charged on multiple counts, including rape, and Rose being charged as an accomplice. Unfortunately, the case later fell to pieces because the children refused to testify, largely in fear of Rose's vindictiveness. Though they were acquitted, the children remained in foster care and were only permitted to see their parents under supervision. This didn't stop police from continuing to look into the Wests and the people who mysteriously disappeared around them. Not only were they sure that something was off, but they couldn't shake the feeling that Fred telling his children that they would wind up under the patio like their sister, which all of the children attested to in their statements to police, was not being said as a joke, but as a warning. After exhaustive efforts, they were finally granted a search warrant on February 23, 1994, to search the property for remains. When they arrived at the house the next day with the warrant, Rose turned stark white and became hysterical. At 11:15 a.m. on February 25, 1994, Fred admitted to police that in a fit of rage, he had killed his daughter Heather and dismembered her body. Fred was insistent that Rose knew nothing about the murder. He agreed to go back to the house and show police where they could find her body. They did indeed find a garbage bag full of dismembered human remains. Upon examination, they were determined to be of a young woman with one kneecap and several fingers missing. The victim had been bound and showed signs of a vicious sexual assault. Her fingernails were discovered in a pile, suggesting that they had been torn off as a means of torture prior to her murder. Dental records confirmed that this was, indeed, the body of Heather West. At the same time they were excavating Heather's body, investigators found a thigh bone in another area of the garden that Fred insisted they didn't need to search. Now formally charged with his daughter's murder, police pressed Fred on why there were additional remains on his property. At first, he admitted to there being 2 additional sets of adult female remains, both former lodgers. The police did not give up, though. They knew there was more to the story, and they kept circling back to his daughter Charmaine and ex-wife Rena, who both seemed to vanish into thin air. On March 4th, Fred admitted to the murders of 9 people, including Charmaine and Rena. He was adamant through all of his admissions that Rose was not involved and had no knowledge of his crimes. Police were not convinced. Rose was arrested on April 24th, initially on rape and physical assault. At this time, she was questioned at length about the abuse, rape, torture, and murder that had taken place on her property. Through her 46 interviews, Rose never swayed, saying only, "I am innocent." A total of 9 sets of remains had been recovered from the home between the garden, the cellar, and underneath of a ground floor bathroom. Forensics worked to corroborate the identities of the bodies with Fred's confession, as well as giving them a thorough examination. The overall findings were that all of the women had likely died from strangulation. All of the bodies had been extensively mutilated and dismembered, some had been fully decapitated. They were all missing numerous bones, particularly fingers, which was Fred's signature, if you will. Fred refused to ever say where the missing body parts were. Most were bound, suffered extreme sexual assaults, and showed signs of having been tortured. The victims on the property were Charmaine West, 8 years old, Though Rose continued to proclaim her innocence, forensic orthodontia proved that she was killed while Fred was still incarcerated. This sweet, beautiful baby girl was killed by Rose in a fit of rage. She was stored in the cellar of the Midland Road home until Fred moved her remains to Cromwell Street. Lydia Goff, 19 years old. She was a lodger at 25 Cromwell Street. She was last seen April 20th, 1973. When Linda's mother came looking for her, Rose denied having ever seen her while wearing her slippers. This bitch, I swear. Carol Ann Cooper, 15 years old. She was last seen boarding a bus to her grandmother's house on November 10th, 1973. Lucy Partington, 21 years old. She was a student at Exeter University. She was abducted from a bus stop on December 27th, 1973. Therese Siegenhalter, 21 years old. She was a sociology student at Greenwich Community College. She was abducted on April 16th, 1974, while hitchhiking. Shirley Hubbard, 15 years old. She was abducted from a bus stop on November 15th, 1974. Juanita Mott, 18 years old. She had also been a lodger at 25 Cromwell Street at one point, but was living with a family friend when she was abducted by the West while hitchhiking on April 12, 1975. Shirley Robinson, 18 years old, another former lodger of 25 Cromwell Street, who was intimate with both Fred and Rose. She was last seen on May 10, 1978, when she was 8 months pregnant with Fred's child. And finally, Heather West, 16 years old, Fred and Rose's own daughter. Fred also admitted to the murders of Anne McFall, 18 years old, Fred's former lover who was last seen in July of 1967. Her remains were found in Much Marcle. She was the first of 2 women to be murdered while 8 months pregnant with Fred's child. Mary Bathsom, 15 years old, a waitress at a cafe that Fred had frequented, last seen on January 6, 1968. Though Fred confessed to kidnapping, raping, and killing her, her remains were never found, so they were unable to charge him with the crime. Catherine Rena Costello, 27 years old, Fred's first wife, who was killed when she came looking for her missing daughter Charmaine in August of 1971. Her remains were found in Letterbox Field. For a small bit of peace, years later, at Anna Marie's request, her mother and sister, Rena and Charmaine, were cremated and buried together. With the victims identified on June 30th, 1994, the magistrate's court officially charged the couple together, Fred with 12 murders and Rose with 9. The hearing was the first time the couple had seen each other since Fred's arrest. Rose completely ignored Fred's presence and actually winced when he placed his hand on her shoulder. This was likely to further her attempt at showing she was simply a battered woman. No one bought it. Fred had already been placed on suicide watch because he was notably very depressed. This only got worse after Rose's public rejection. She was also refusing to answer any of his letters. She was leaning all the way into the role of the grieving mother who had just lost her daughter and stepdaughter at the hands of her husband, who she now declared she hated. There have been many rumors over the years that the Wests had a pact that if they were ever caught, Fred would take the fall for Rose. But something tells me that her completely writing him off wasn't part of the deal. On New Year's Day, 1995, Fred was found dead in his cell from having hung himself. The court was now faced with a tough decision. The couple were originally charged together. After much deliberation, they decided to add 1 additional count of murder to Rose's list, giving her a total of 10 murder charges. In his opening statement, prosecutor Brian Levinson held nothing back as he painted a picture for the jury of the sex-obsessed, sadistic murders, saying, quote, "The victim's last moments on earth were as objects of the depravity of this woman and her husband." Rose's trial lasted 31 days. Anna Marie testified, sending chills down the spines of every person in the room as she recalled what it was like growing up in the West household. Also taking the stand was Carolyn Owens. Her testimony about what Fred and Rose had put her through was absolutely damning. I cannot even imagine how hard it was for these poor women to have to relive those events. They are fucking heroes. On November 22nd, 1995, the jury unanimously convicted Rose on all 10 counts of murder, terming her crimes, quote, "appalling and depraved." She was given life in prison without the possibility of parole. Justice Mantell praised the jury, saying, quote, "You will never have had a more important job to do in your life. You deserve my thanks and the country's for the part you have played." When asked if justice was served, Rose's own solicitor, Leo Goatley, said, quote, "Would I have found her guilty? Well, possibly. Put it this way, I wouldn't sleep at night if I was convinced she was innocent, and I do sleep quite well at night." Rose refused to accept her fate and appealed her convictions in 1996 and 2000. She made claims that new evidence had come to light proving her innocence. None was ever found. And that with the case being on the world's stage and the media's portrayal of the crimes, it made it impossible for her to get a fair trial. Just, again, fuck all the way off, Rose. The 1996 appeal was rejected, and she dropped the 2000 appeal. She remains at HM Prison, New Hall, in West Yorkshire, England, where she will spend the rest of her miserable days. To use Rose's own words, "and bloody good riddance." I hope that every possible bad thing that can happen to a person happens to you, Rose. I hope you happen to you. The aftermath of this case is truly heartbreaking. Anna Marie attempted suicide 2 weeks after giving her testimony against Rose, and again in 1999. Neither attempt were successful. She is now 59 years old. I didn't find much about her outside of what was included in the information on the case, and honestly, I didn't go looking. I hope she has found the peace that she so truly deserves. One of their sons, Stephen, attempted suicide in 2002. In 2004, he was sent to prison for 9 months for the statutory rape of a 14-year-old girl. Their other son, Barry, committed suicide by overdose in 2020 at the age of 40 after dealing with lifelong psychological issues. All of the living adult West children refused to have contact with Rose. The 4 youngest West children were given new identities for their protection and placed into foster care. I can only hope that they escaped with as little damage as possible and are thriving. The trauma caused by the many, many monsters in this story are immeasurable. Those who made it out still carry the weight of the horrors inflicted upon them. My heart absolutely breaks for the innocent people who died or had their lives ripped apart by these bottom-dwelling bitches. The 25 Cromwell Street House of Horrors was demolished in 1996. In its place is now a pathway to the town center. Alright, I don't know about you guys, but I need a shower or a hug or both. I don't know. That was horrendous. There is no other way to put it. There is also no good way to come out of this one. But I do have an interesting quote to share with you guys. I am obsessed with the X-Files, and for future reference, literally anything that is even near Gillian Anderson's orbit. So here is an X-Files fun fact. Chris Carter, the creator of the X-Files, was told that he was close to the truth. In a 2016 interview with the Huffington Post, he said, quote, "When I wrote the pilot, I called the FBI to do some research, and they were nice enough, but didn't really give me the time of day. Then all of a sudden, as we got close to airing, the FBI called and said, 'Who are you, and what are you doing?' For a second, I thought it was going to be the long arm of the law coming in to shut me down." In the same interview, he also said, quote, "I had someone come up to me during the original run of the series who said they worked in some high place in a secret government agency and that we were very close to the truth. The truth is out there, friends, and I want to believe." That's all I've got for you today, my guys, gals, and non-binary pals. Tune in next week as we head up north to Canada, to take a look into a killer who had some surprising Hollywood aspirations. If you're liking the podcast, please subscribe, rate, and review. Also, please keep spreading the word. It helps tremendously. You can find me on Facebook and Instagram at Criminally Nerdy Podcast, Twitter, X, whatever, at Crime Nerd Pod, or shoot me an email at criminallynerdypodcast@gmail.com. Till next time, keep it nerdy. I am your singing telegram. Bam! What a fucking tool. Paris? Paris. Ugh, that's so gross. Da-da-da-da-da. Barf. Mama Bear. Sounds like a weird name. Damn it. No, it wasn't. Motherfucker.